Captain Cade Solera stood on the rocky plains of the distant alien world, his pulse steady, his hands gripping the hilt of his sword. His mission had been clear: defeat Sarvok, the ruthless warlord who ruled over this planet, and countless others. Sarvok was known throughout the galaxy for his brutal conquests and his cruelty, but Cade was different. He was a warrior, a fighter, not a conqueror. He had faced countless battles, and this one would be no different. The alien world was stark and barren, with jagged mountains in the distance and a sky filled with dark clouds. Sarvok stood across from Cade, his towering figure nearly twice the size of a human. His armor glinted in the dim light, and his eyes burned with a cold, calculating rage. Sarvok's reputation as a ruthless leader had preceded him, but Cade was not intimidated. He had faced the strongest foes the galaxy had to offer, and he would face this one just as he had faced them all, head-on. With a roar, Sarvok charged, his weapon raised high, aiming to crush Cade with a single strike. But Cade was faster. He dodged to the side, his movements smooth and calculated. He had trained for moments like this. With a quick twist of his body, he lunged forward, his blade cutting through the air and clashing against Sarvok's armor. The two combatants exchanged blows, their swords ringing out with each strike. Cade's speed and precision were his greatest assets, but Sarvok's strength was unmatched. Cade needed to be smart, not just strong. The battle raged on for what felt like hours. Sarvok's brute strength was a challenge, but Cade's agility and experience allowed him to stay one step ahead. The ground beneath them was scared by the force of their battle, each strike sending shockwaves through the landscape. Finally, Cade saw his opening. With a swift, calculated move, he disarmed Sarvok and brought his sword down on the warlord's shoulder, forcing him to his knees. Sarvok looked up, blood dripping from his wound. His eyes burned with hatred, but there was a flicker of respect hidden beneath his anger. He knew he had been beaten. Cade had done the impossible. He had defeated one of the most feared warlords in the galaxy. But just as Cade stood over him, victorious, the unexpected happened. Sarvok's two wives, Arila and Kalara, stepped forward from the shadows. They were not like the women Cade had encountered before. Arila was tall and graceful, her eyes sharp and calculating, while Kalara was shorter but muscular, with the intense gaze of a warrior who had fought in countless battles. They were beautiful, but there was a coldness in their eyes, a dangerous power. "You have defeated our husband," Arila said, her voice smooth but laced with authority. "But that does not mean you are free." Cade narrowed his eyes, confused. "What do you mean?" "You are now bound to us," Kalara declared. "You may have won the battle, but the war is far from over. You will take us as your own, or face the consequences." Cade frowned. He had heard of alien customs, but this was something entirely different. "I don't want your power or your rule," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Arila's lips curled into a smile. "It's not a matter of choice. You have already won our husband's throne. Now, you must take his place." Cade's mind raced. He had come to defeat a tyrant, but now he was trapped in a game of politics that he hadn't asked to play. The battle may have been won, but the real challenge had only just begun. Cade stood in silence, his mind racing. The words of Sarvok's wives echoed in his head. "You will take us as your own, or face the consequences." He had come here to fight, to defeat a tyrant. But now he found himself tangled in something far more complicated. Two powerful women, each with her own ambitions, were demanding that he accept them into his life. Arila's piercing eyes studied Cade carefully, waiting for his response. Her posture was perfect, graceful, and confident. Kalara, standing just behind her, crossed her arms, her gaze less calculating, but no less intense. Cade could feel the weight of their eyes on him. He didn't know what to say or how to respond to such an unexpected demand. "What do you want from me?" Cade finally asked, his voice steady but laced with confusion. Arila stepped forward, her tone smooth, almost persuasive. You defeated Sarvok, and now you have claimed his power. But this planet doesn't work like the worlds you know. You cannot just walk away from what you've won. Kalara snorted, her voice rougher. This is not about power. It's about survival. If you do not accept us, others will come, and they will take everything you have fought for. Cade could feel the pressure building around him. He had not come here for this. He had not come to be a ruler or to inherit a throne. He was a soldier, a fighter, not a king. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that leaving would not be an option. These women held power, influence, and without their support, his victory would mean nothing. I don't want to rule, Cade said, his voice growing firmer. I didn't come here to take over Sarvok's life or throne. I came to end his reign of terror. Arila's lips curled into a faint smile. You may not want to rule, but the galaxy does not care about your desires. The people will see you as their new leader, whether you accept it or not. And if you refuse us, we will make sure that no one remembers your victory. We are the key to your survival here. Kalara stepped closer, her tone hardening. Accept us, and we will ensure that you remain in control. Without us, you'll be nothing more than a pawn in a game you don't even understand. Cade's eyes narrowed. He had faced many difficult situations before, but this felt different. It wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for his very freedom. If he accepted these women, he would be tied to a political system he didn't want to be part of. Yet, if he rejected them, he risked losing everything he had fought for. He glanced between Arila and Kalara, his mind filled with uncertainty. There was no easy choice here. The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't leave without consequences. I'll accept your help, Cade said reluctantly. But understand this, I won't be your puppet. I will rule my way, and I'll make my own decisions. Arila nodded slowly, her smile cold but approving. Good. We can work with that. But remember, Cade, you are now part of a much larger game. Kalara gave a sharp nod, her expression unreadable. And we'll make sure you're not alone in it. Cade couldn't shake the feeling that his decision had set him on a path he couldn't turn back from. He had defeated Sarvok in battle, but in doing so, he had unknowingly taken on a far greater challenge. As the two women turned and began to walk away, Cade was left standing there, wondering what kind of ruler he was about to become, and what price he would have to pay for his victory. Cade sat in the grand hall of Sarvok's palace, the weight of his new position pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. The palace was a blend of alien architecture, sharp, angular structures adorned with strange, glowing symbols. Everything about this place felt foreign. From the air he breathed to the customs he was forced to follow. Yet, as the new ruler of this planet, it was his responsibility to maintain order and to keep Sarvok's empire from collapsing. The two women, Arila and Kalara, stood beside him, their presence both comforting and unsettling. Arila, with her sharp mind and smooth words, had already begun to guide him through the political maze of Sarvok's former empire. Kalara, on the other hand, was more direct, focusing on military strategy and keeping the planet's defenses intact. Each of them brought their own set of skills, but also their own agendas. Cade knew that he couldn't trust either of them fully, but he had little choice. They were now his closest allies and potential threats. Arila leaned in, her voice low and smooth. You need to understand, Cade, that our people do not respect weakness. They see your victory as a sign of strength, but that strength must be maintained. If you show any sign of hesitation, any sign of uncertainty, they will turn on you. Cade glanced at her, his eyes hard. I don't need a lesson on power, Arila. I've fought in enough battles to know what it takes. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It's not just about fighting. It's about control. Sarvok's allies are not here because they admire him. They're here because they fear him, and now they fear you. But that fear will fade, Cade. unless you give them something to keep them in line. Cade frowned. And what would that be? Arila's smile grew wider. You must show them that you are their ruler, not just by force, but by making the right alliances. You will need to marry into other influential families. Form bonds that will solidify your rule. But it's not just about forming alliances. It's about understanding the politics of this world, who can be trusted and who can't. Lara, who had been silently listening, spoke up. Arila's right, but you can't trust anyone completely. Every leader on this planet has their own ambition. The ones who claim loyalty are usually the first to stab you in the back. Cade nodded slowly. He knew Lara was right. He had already felt the cold eyes of Sarvok's former allies watching him, waiting to see if he would slip. The last thing he wanted was to appear weak, but the thought of using marriage as a political tool felt foreign to him. In his world, love and loyalty had always been earned, not bartered like goods. As he walked through the halls with Arila and Lara, he saw the faces of Sarvok's former allies. Each one looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They didn't know whether to fear him or admire him yet. But soon, he realized, they would all know what he was capable of. His military strength had won the battle, but now it was his political skill that would determine his future. Arila turned to him, her eyes gleaming. We can do this, Cade. Together, we'll make sure that no one dares to challenge your rule. Cade hesitated. He had never wanted this, but there was no turning back now. If he wanted to survive, he had to play their game. I'll do it my way, Cade said, his voice firm. Arila smiled, and Lara gave a sharp nod. The game had only just begun, and Cade was no longer just a soldier. He was now a player in a dangerous alien game of power. Cade had barely begun to adjust to his new life when he was thrust into his first true test as the ruler of Sarvok's empire. Word had come that two rival factions, the Darnak clan and the Vothians, were on the brink of war. Both factions had long been at odds, and Sarvok had kept them in check with force. But now, with Sarvok gone and Cade in his place, the balance of power was shifting, and the factions were ready to clash. Arila wasted no time in drawing Cade into the situation. She had already begun working behind the scenes, trying to make alliances with both factions, but she knew that the decision Cade made would be the turning point. War was not an option. If the factions went to war, it would tear apart the fragile empire Cade had inherited. We have to act quickly, Cade, Arila said, her tone sharp. If we don't intervene, this planet will burn. We can't afford to show weakness. Cade stood in the command room, his hands resting on the cold metal of the table in front of him. Maps of the planet's regions and troop movements were projected above the table, and the tension in the room was palpable. Lara stood to his right, arms crossed, her gaze intense as she studied the displays. Both factions have their strengths, Lara said, her voice low. The Darnaks are skilled in guerrilla tactics, and they have the support of the miners in the south. The Vothians, on the other hand, control the planetary defenses. If we don't handle this carefully, we'll lose control of both sides. Cade nodded. So, what's the plan? Arila stepped forward, her fingers dancing across the holographic display. We must make them believe that we are stronger than both factions combined. We'll show them that they have no choice but to unite under your rule. Cade's brow furrowed. And how do we do that? Arila's smile was cold, calculated. We will force them to meet in a neutral location. We'll arrange a demonstration of power, something that will make them realize that you are not just another puppet to be controlled. We will show them the might of Sarvok's empire, and they will bow to you. Lara spoke up, her tone blunt. It's risky. If they see through it, we could lose everything. The factions won't just challenge your rule. They'll tear this empire apart. Cade looked at both of them, weighing his options. The idea of forcing the factions to meet in a neutral zone felt like a gamble, but he knew he had no other choice. If he backed down now, he would lose the support of both sides. But if he succeeded, he would prove his strength and secure his position. Let's do it, Cade said finally, his voice firm. We need to show them we're not afraid. I'll make sure they understand who's in charge. The plan was set into motion. Cade and his advisors arranged for a meeting between the leaders of the Darnak clan and the Vothians at a remote location, far from their strongholds. The meeting was intended to be a peaceful negotiation, but Cade knew it would be anything but peaceful. Arila had arranged for a demonstration of the planet's advanced weaponry, something the factions had never seen before. When the factions arrived, Cade stood at the center of a vast arena, his eyes scanning the crowd of alien leaders. The Darnak clan's warriors, fierce and proud, stood in one group, while the Vothians, armed with their high-tech weapons, stood across from them. The tension in the air was thick, and Cade could feel the weight of the moment. This was his chance to make his mark. Arila gave him a nod, signaling that the demonstration was ready. Cade raised his hand, signaling the start of the display. Suddenly, the sky above the arena erupted with blinding light as a fleet of ships appeared, their weapons charging. The ground beneath their feet trembled as Cade's forces activated a massive weapon, a show of power designed to demonstrate the might of the Empire. The two factions watched in stunned silence as the power of the weapon was unleashed, sending shockwaves through the ground. The demonstration was a success. Both factions had been shown just how powerful Cade's empire had become under his rule. As the dust settled and the arena fell quiet, Cade stepped forward. His voice rang out across the arena, calm and commanding. "This is the power of Sarvok's empire," he said. "And this is the power that will keep us all safe. You have a choice: unite under my rule, or face the consequences." The leaders of the Darnak clan and the Vothians exchanged uneasy glances. They had been shown the might of Cade's forces, and the message was clear: fight him. And they would lose everything. Slowly, one by one, they nodded in agreement. Cade had won, for now. As the leaders departed, Cade couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. He had passed his first test, and for the moment, he had secured his position. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, and the game of power was far from over. Cade walked through the corridors of Sarvok's palace, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the quiet halls. He had just returned from the meeting with the Darnak clan and the Vothians, and while the factions had agreed to unite under his rule, the victory felt hollow. Yes, he had shown his strength, but it had come at a cost. The power he wielded now was not just the result of his military victory. It was a dangerous tool, one that required constant vigilance and manipulation. Arila and Kaelura had insisted on the demonstration, pushing Cade to make a statement that would cement his control over the planet. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the faction leaders after the weapon was unleashed. It had worked. Cade had shown them that he was not to be trifled with. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the power he had taken on was slowly changing him. He stopped in front of the large window overlooking the dark landscape. The planet's vast deserts stretched out in front of him. The only sign of life, the occasional flicker of movement far in the distance. In the quiet, Cade could almost forget the weight of the crown that had been forced upon him. Arila's voice broke the silence, smooth and calculated. "You did well today, Cade. The factions are now united, but they will test you again. And you must be prepared." Cade turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Prepared for what? Arila smiled, but it was the smile of a predator, not a ruler. "They will push you to see if you are truly in control. The Darnak clan and the Vothians are not the only players in this game. There are others who will watch you closely, waiting for a weakness." Cade shook his head, frustration building inside him. "I don't want this. I didn't come here to play political games. I came to end Sarvok's reign." Arila's eyes softened, though her tone remained sharp. "You ended his reign, Cade. But this is the price of power. There is no going back. The galaxy doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about strength. And now you have it. But be careful. Strength can make you enemies just as quickly as it makes you allies." Cade clenched his fists, anger bubbling up. He had fought for freedom, for justice, yet here he was, stuck in a game of manipulation and control. He had seen what power could do to a person, and he had sworn he would never become like Sarvak. But with each passing day, the lines between right and wrong seemed to blur. Kalara, who had been standing quietly in the corner, spoke up. Arila's right. There's no going back, Cade. You have to decide if you're going to be the ruler this planet needs, or if you'll be another casualty of the game. Cade looked between the two women, both of whom had become key players in his new life. They were right, but the truth felt like a heavy burden. He had been thrust into a position he never wanted, and the price of his victory was his own soul. As he stood there, lost in thought, a messenger entered the room, bowing low before Cade. "My lord," the messenger said, "there's an urgent matter. One of the Darnak clan's leaders has been assassinated." Cade's heart sank. The Darnaks were a proud and dangerous people, and if one of their leaders had been killed, it would throw the fragile peace into chaos. His mind raced as he processed the information. If the factions broke out into open conflict again, everything he had worked for could come crumbling down. Arila's expression darkened. "This was no accident, Cade. Someone wants to destabilize your rule." Cade's jaw tightened. "I'll find out who did this, and when I do, they will pay." As the messenger left, Cade turned to face the women once more. "What do I do now?" Kalara stepped forward, her voice steady. "You do what you must. Find the traitor and make an example of them. Show the factions that your power is unbreakable." Cade's mind was already working through the possibilities. The assassin could be anyone, someone within the Darnak clan, or even someone closer to him. Whoever it was, they had just thrown down a challenge, and Cade wasn't one to back down. With a deep breath, Cade turned to leave the room. He had gained power, but he was beginning to realize that with power came enemies, and those enemies wouldn't hesitate to strike when his back was turned. The game had only just begun, and Cade was determined to win it, no matter the cost. The tension in the palace was palpable. Cade had spent the last few days investigating the assassination of the Darnak clan leader, but the truth remained elusive. No one had claimed responsibility, and the evidence was scant. It felt like someone was deliberately hiding in the shadows, making it impossible for Cade to find the person behind the murder. Arila and Kalara had urged him to act swiftly. The longer he waited, the more likely it was that the factions would lose faith in his leadership. Every moment felt like a ticking clock, and Cade knew that any misstep could shatter the fragile peace he had fought so hard to establish. "I don't like this," Cade muttered to himself, pacing in the dimly lit war room. The map of the planet, with its various territories and faction territories marked in glowing colors, seemed to mock him. There were too many unknowns, too many places where enemies could hide. Arila entered, her expression tight, her eyes searching Cade's face. "You've been up for days, Cade. You need rest." Cade glanced at her, his jaw set. "I don't have time for rest. Someone is playing us all, and I need to find out who before they strike again." Arila stepped closer, her voice low and persuasive. "I understand, but you have to be careful. The more desperate you become, the more likely it is you'll make mistakes." Cade didn't respond, his mind too preoccupied with the mystery to focus on her words. His instincts told him that the assassin was someone close to him, perhaps one of his own allies. But who? Who had the resources to strike within the Darnak clan and then vanish without a trace? Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "We found something," Kalara said, entering the room with a data pad in her hands. Cade's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Kalara handed him the data pad. "It's a trail of transactions, small, inconspicuous payments made to a former mercenary group that's known for doing dirty work." Cade frowned. Mercenaries? Who would hire them? Kalara's eyes narrowed. Someone with a lot of money and a grudge against the Darnaks. These payments came from an account linked to the Vothian faction. Cade felt a chill run down his spine. The Vothians. He had suspected that they might be involved, but he hadn't expected them to make such a bold move. If they were behind the assassination, it could mean that they were testing him, pushing him to act, perhaps even pushing the Darnaks into war with him. "I knew it," Cade muttered. "The Vothians want to destabilize things. They want to see me fail." Arila's eyes flashed with understanding. "They're trying to force your hand, Cade. They know that if the factions go to war, your control will crumble." Cade clenched his fists. The Vothians had made their move, and now Cade had to decide how to respond. But one thing was clear. He could not allow them to continue pulling the strings. His control was fragile enough without outside interference. "We need to send a message," Cade said, his voice cold and decisive. Arila and Kellerat exchanged a glance before Arila spoke. "What do you have in mind?" Cade's gaze hardened. "I'm going to confront the Vothians directly. We'll put pressure on them, force them to admit their involvement. If they refuse, we'll use their own tactics against them." Kellerat nodded. A bold move, but it could work. "If we strike at their heart, we'll show them that we're not afraid." Cade's mind was already racing. He would need to move quickly. The longer he waited, the more control the Vothians would gain. He had to act now, before they managed to push the factions into chaos. "We'll gather our forces," Cade said, his voice firm. "Prepare for a strike. We'll hit them where it hurts, right in their supply lines. If we can cripple their resources, we'll force them to the negotiation table." Arila raised an eyebrow. "And if they don't negotiate, then we make them," Cade replied coldly. "We show them what happens when you mess with me." The plan was set into motion. As Cade prepared for the assault, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his choices. Every action now had consequences, and with each decision, he was sinking deeper into the game of power. There was no turning back. He had to win, no matter the cost. The game of survival had become a dangerous dance, and Cade was determined to come out on top. But as the pieces moved into place, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the true mastermind was still out there, waiting, hidden in the shadows. The sun had barely risen when Cade's forces set out for the Vothian stronghold. The atmosphere was thick with tension as they prepared for what would be a decisive moment. The Vothians had made their move, and now it was Cade's turn to show that he was not someone to be easily intimidated. Arila had helped him craft the plan, a bold and risky move to hit the Vothian supply lines and force them into a corner. Kellerat had already mobilized the military units, and the elite strike team was ready. Cade stood at the command center, watching the final preparations unfold. His eyes were steady, but his mind was racing. This was not just a military strike. It was a statement. If the Vothians backed down, they would know he was a force to be reckoned with. If they didn't, things could spiral out of control very quickly. "We're in position." Kellerat's voice came through the comms, sharp and focused. "The Vothians won't see us coming." Cade nodded, his jaw tight. "Make sure no one leaves alive. We need to send a clear message." Arila, standing next to him, studied the map on the screen, her fingers tracing the lines of the enemy's defenses. "The Vothians have hidden their key resources well, but they're not invincible. We've studied their supply routes for weeks now. If we hit them hard enough, they'll have no choice but to surrender." Cade's mind was made up. He had no patience left for negotiations. The Vothians had crossed a line when they had assassinated the Darnak clan leader. They were trying to weaken his rule, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. The strike team moved swiftly, their ships barely detectable as they moved through the dense atmosphere of the planet. Cade watched from the command center as the first wave of ships began to descend upon the Vothian supply base. The strike was sudden, violent, and efficient. The explosions shook the ground as Cade's forces tore through the Vothian defenses, cutting off their escape routes and decimating their supplies. From the cockpit of his ship, Cade could see the chaos unfolding below. The Vothians had clearly underestimated him. Their response was slower than expected, and their defenses quickly crumbled under the intensity of the attack. Cade felt a surge of satisfaction, but he couldn't allow himself to get too comfortable. This was just the beginning. "Arila," Cade said, his voice steady, "make sure we leave no trace. I don't want them to have anything to rebuild with." She nodded, her face cold. "Understood. We'll make sure their entire supply chain is wiped out." Cade's comms crackled as Kalura's voice came through again. "We've got incoming reinforcements. Vothian fighters. They're coming in fast." Cade didn't hesitate. "Intercept them. Don't give them a chance to regroup." The battle raged on for hours. Cade's forces fought with precision, cutting through the Vothians like a blade through paper. The Vothians, realizing they were being outclassed, tried to make a last-ditch effort to escape, but Cade was ready. His forces surrounded the remaining enemy fighters, trapping them in a deadlock. It wasn't long before the Vothians realized they had no choice but to surrender. Cade's message had been clear. If they wanted to challenge his authority, they would face the full force of his power. The Vothian leadership, beaten and broken, sent a desperate plea for negotiation. Cade's ship hovered above the remaining Vothian base as the smoke cleared. His hands were still clenched tightly around the controls. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Vothians had been humbled, but Cade knew they would never stop plotting. They would rebuild. They always did. And the only way to keep control was to remain stronger, faster, and more ruthless than ever. When the dust settled, Cade met with Arila and Kalura in the debriefing room. There was no celebration, no relief, just cold determination. "The Vothians have been beaten," Kalura said, her voice heavy with the weight of the fight. "But they'll come back. They always do." Arila added, "We've shown them what happens when they cross you, Cade, but you need to stay one step ahead. If we're not careful, they'll regroup and try again." Cade stared at the map on the wall. The Vothians were down, but not out. And in this game of power, there was always someone waiting in the shadows, ready to strike when you were least prepared. "I won't give them that chance," Cade said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'll make sure the Vothians know this was their last warning. From now on, anyone who dares challenge my rule will face the same fate." The room was silent for a moment. Then Arila spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You've made your mark, Cade. But remember, every victory has a cost." Cade didn't answer. He didn't need to. The price of power was something he was starting to understand all too well, and he wasn't sure if he could ever pay it off. The days following the attack on the Vothian supply base had been quiet, too quiet. Cade spent most of his time in the war room, poring over reports and trying to plan his next move. The Vothians had been humiliated, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. The peace had been broken, and now, more than ever, Cade had to keep his guard up. His enemies would be watching him, waiting for any sign of weakness. Cade's power was built on the fact that no one could challenge him and succeed, but the reality of ruling a fractured galaxy was slowly wearing on him. Arila was the first to break the silence. "Cade, we've received a transmission from a neutral party," she said, her voice calm but her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "They claim to have information about a new threat." Cade looked up from the map he had been studying. "A new threat? Who?" She handed him the datapad. On it was a message from an unknown source, the words written in a cryptic code. Cade's brows furrowed as he read through the message. It spoke of a shadow organization, one that had been working behind the scenes to destabilize the galaxy. The Vothians weren't the only ones who had their eyes on Cade's growing power. "We have no idea who this is," Arila continued, her voice tense. "But it's clear that they know about our plans. They've been watching us." Cade slammed the datapad down onto the table. "Why haven't we heard of this group before? And why are they contacting us now?" Kalura, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "It could be a trap. Someone is trying to play us against each other, to weaken your position further." Arila nodded. We don't know their motives yet, but we can't ignore this. Whoever they are, they're dangerous. Cade rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every decision he made now had more consequences. If there was a shadow group out there pulling the strings, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Prepare for a meeting with this group," Cade said, his voice sharp. "If they want to play games, we'll play along. But I won't be their pawn." Kalara raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about this? We don't know who we're dealing with." "I'm not giving up control," Cade said firmly. "This galaxy is mine, and I'll make sure it stays that way." Days later, Cade stood in a secluded chamber, waiting for the mysterious representatives to arrive. Arila and Kalara stood beside him, ready for anything. The air was thick with tension as the door slid open, revealing a figure dressed in a dark cloak. "You're the one who's been causing so much trouble," the figure said, their voice cold and emotionless. Cade's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The figure slowly removed their hood, revealing a face Cade recognized. It was a face from his past, a man he had once considered an ally. Toran, a former general in Sarvok's army. "You," Cade said, his voice betraying his shock. "I thought you were dead." Toran smiled grimly. "I was, or at least that's what you thought. But I've been working behind the scenes, building something far bigger than you can imagine." Arila stepped forward, her tone icy. "You've been the one pulling the strings all along." Toran's eyes flashed. "I wasn't the one who started this, Cade, but I'm the one who will finish it. You've made a powerful enemy, and I'm here to make sure you remember that." Cade's blood ran cold. He had underestimated Toran, and now he was paying the price. The former general had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" Cade's voice was low, dangerous. "You're wrong. This galaxy is mine now." Toran's smile widened. "We'll see, Cade. We'll see who has the last word." As the mysterious figure turned to leave, Cade felt a sense of dread settle over him. The game had changed once again, and this time it wasn't just about power, it was about survival. Toran had returned, and he wasn't alone. The Shadow Organization was real, and Cade had just become their #1 target. Arila and Kalara exchanged glances, both sensing the gravity of the situation. Cade clenched his fists, his mind already working through the possibilities. He had made an enemy of the wrong person, and now he had to face the consequences. But one thing was clear: Cade was not going to back down. Not now, not ever. Toran had made a dangerous mistake by showing himself. Cade would make sure it would be the last mistake Toran ever made. Cade sat alone in his quarters, the weight of the recent meeting heavy on his mind. Toran's appearance had caught him off guard. He had always trusted the man, thought of him as an ally. But now he realized that trust had been misplaced. Toran was no longer the man he had known. The former general had become something far more dangerous. A shadow, lurking in the background, waiting to strike when the time was right. Arila and Kalara had left him to think, giving him space to process everything that had happened. They had advised him to stay cautious, to avoid rushing into any decisions. But Cade couldn't wait. The stakes were too high now. Toran had been building something behind the scenes, and Cade needed to know what it was before it was too late. He paced the room, his thoughts racing. How had Toran survived all these years? And why had he chosen now to reveal himself? Everything Cade had worked for was at risk. The power he had gained, his position, was fragile. A single wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. His comm device beeped, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a secure message from one of his trusted lieutenants, a soldier who had been working in the outer territories. Cade quickly activated the message, his eyes scanning the report. "We've intercepted a transmission," the lieutenant said, voice shaking with urgency. "It's from Toran's group. They're planning something big, Cade. They've gathered a fleet in the far reaches of the galaxy. They're getting ready to strike." Cade's heart raced. This was it. Torin wasn't just waiting to make a move, he was preparing for war. The Shadow Group was no longer in the background. They were ready to act, and Cade needed to act fast if he wanted to stop them. He slammed his fist against the table. How long until they strike? Less than a week, the lieutenant replied. They're moving quickly. Cade knew he didn't have much time. He needed to assemble his forces, strengthen his defenses, and prepare for the worst. Torin had chosen his moment, and now Cade had to make sure it would be his last mistake. He stood up and grabbed his weapon belt, securing it around his waist. "Prepare my fleet," he commanded, voice firm. "We're going to hit them first." Arila and Kalara arrived shortly after, both of them looking grim. They had already heard the news. Arila didn't waste any time. "Torin's making his move," she said. "We have to stop him before he can launch his attack." Kalara's expression was hard. "We know his tactics. He's not going to come at us head-on. He'll try to weaken us first, pick us off one by one." Cade nodded. "Then we need to do the opposite. We hit him hard. We don't give him a chance to regroup." The three of them quickly made plans to mobilize Cade's fleet. They would have to move quickly, silently, and with precision. There was no room for error. Cade could already picture the battle in his mind. The ships, the explosions, the chaos. It was going to be a war of attrition, and Cade had no intention of losing. As they prepared for the confrontation, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that Torin was always one step ahead. The former general had been planning this for years, building his network in the shadows. He had set the pieces in motion, and now it was up to Cade to stop him. The clock was ticking, and the time for hesitation had passed. Cade would lead his forces into battle, not just to protect his position, but to destroy Torin and his Shadow Group once and for all. As the first wave of ships departed from the palace, Cade stood at the helm of his command ship, staring out into the vastness of space. The fleet was ready, and the fight was inevitable. The shadows had come for him. Now it was time for Cade to bring the light. He wasn't going to let Torin destroy everything he had fought for. Not now, not ever. Cade stood at the front of his flagship, gazing out at the vast emptiness of space. The stars stretched out before him, cold and indifferent. His fleet was assembled, every ship in place, ready for the final confrontation. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now the time had come to face Torin and the Shadow Group head-on. Torin had underestimated him once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Arila and Kalara stood beside Cade, both of them silent. They understood the gravity of what was about to happen. This wasn't just a battle for control of the galaxy. It was a battle for Cade's survival. If he lost, everything he had worked for would be destroyed, and the Shadow Group would rise in his place. There was no turning back now. "It's time," Cade said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Get the fleet ready. We strike at dawn." The entire command ship rumbled as the engines roared to life. The fleet, a massive collection of warships and support vessels, moved into position. Cade's heart raced, but he kept his emotions in check. This wasn't the time for doubt. This wasn't the time for hesitation. He had one shot to end this. "We're moving into position," Kalara reported. "Torin's fleet is directly ahead. They've set up a defensive perimeter." "Good," Cade said, his eyes narrowing. "We'll punch through their defenses and hit them where it hurts. Take down their command ships first. If we cripple their leadership, the rest of the fleet will fall apart." Arila stepped forward, her face set in a hard line. "This will be a tough fight. They know we're coming. But we have to be relentless. We can't give them any room to breathe." Cade nodded, a fire burning in his chest. "Then we make sure they don't." The battle began as soon as Cade's fleet came within range. The first wave of torpedoes launched, tearing through the blackness of space toward the enemy fleet. Torin's ships retaliated quickly, firing back with deadly precision. The explosions lit up the sky like distant stars. the sounds of war reverberating through the hulls of both fleets. Cade's command ship shook as it took a hit, but he held his ground. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was everything. There was no turning back. His hands gripped the controls, guiding the ship through the chaos of battle. His fleet followed, coordinated, moving in perfect synchronization. "Target the enemy flagship," Cade ordered. Kaelura's voice came through the comms. "We're on it," launching a full strike on their command vessel now. Cade watched as his fleet unleashed everything they had on Torrhen's flagship. The massive ship shuddered under the barrage, shields flickering as the first round of attacks did. Cade knew that if they could bring down Torrhen's command ship, the rest of his fleet would be easy to dismantle. But Torrhen's forces weren't going down without a fight. They retaliated with fury, launching counterattacks at Cade's ships, trying to break the lines. It was chaos, pure and simple. Fighters darted through the debris of destroyed ships, weaving in and out of enemy fire. "Watch your six," Kaelura shouted over the comms, warning Cade as an enemy fighter tried to slip past his defenses. Cade's heart raced as he pulled his ship out of the line of fire, narrowly avoiding a missile. He gritted his teeth. "Get them off me." Within moments, a squadron of his best pilots dove in, taking down the enemy fighter before it could cause more damage. Cade's command ship was still in the fight, though the damage was mounting. He couldn't afford to slow down now. They had to finish this, no matter the cost. Torrhen's flagship was now in sight, battered and struggling to stay intact. Cade could see the lights flicker inside, and he knew the time had come to end it. He gave the order to fire everything they had left. The final volley of missiles exploded against Torrhen's ship. It groaned under the pressure before it erupted in a massive fireball. The shockwave rocked Cade's ship, but they held firm. Torrhen's flagship was no more. The enemy fleet began to break apart, the remaining ships surrendering or fleeing into the void. Cade's forces pressed on, finishing off the last pockets of resistance. As the dust settled and the battlefield fell silent, Cade allowed himself a moment of relief. It was over. He had won. Arela and Kaelura joined him on the bridge, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and victory. "You did it," Arela said quietly. "The shadow group is finished." Cade nodded, though his expression remained grim. "It's not just about winning, Arela. It's about making sure we never have to fight this battle again." Kaelura's eyes were cold. "Torrhen underestimated you. He thought you'd fall, but you showed him what you're really capable of."